Yeah, I want to welcome you to our Peace TV. And Peace TV has certain guidelines. Number one is better understanding important questions of life, society, and cosmic natural laws and in our life. Welcome Stephen Stacy today he wrote a very interesting book about sexual correctness. Can our nations de-transition from harmful transgender legislation? Stephen, I want to welcome you, and can you tell a little bit more about yourself?
Hello, Johan. Hi, everyone. Yes, I lectured at university for several years on personal development, and I'm very interested in how human beings can become better at being human. And I taught things such as understanding the cross-cultural divide, or building better marriages, or becoming a better employee, all kinds of things about internal development. And then I kind of got involved in trying to understand social development, and and became extremely worried when I looked at the research, because it became evident and increasingly clear that each generation we are experiencing worse outcomes than the previous generation. And I was really trying to wonder, I started to wonder why some of our children are experiencing worse outcomes when we seem to have such a capable world. And so I became interested in social issues. And I started writing a book on trying to understand social issues. And the transgender issue just grew and grew and grew. And it started to fill such a large part of the book, but that I decided to separate it off and create a book on its own, and which became entitled Sexual Political Correctness, Can Our Nations De-Transition from Harmful Transgender Legislation? Because I started to see the damage that transgender legislation and policies were creating for many groups of people, and I just said that this is so much damage here to the social fabric that we have to try and understand this issue more deeply, and before we go too far down this road and create a lot of social damage, in order to somehow comfort the feelings of a very, very small number of people. It's not worth damaging so many other people in order to try to comfort a few people. So I wrote this book, and now Johan and I, we are somehow related in one way or another, and we are sharing thoughts today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. That's a very interesting topic what you have, and a very wide topic. And it's also a very, in the German we have a saying, you lean yourself very far out of the window. This kind of saying means you expose yourself quite a lot, because it's a very sensitive question for many people, in case of human rights, in case of many things. And but as a lecturer, as you said, in university, I'm sure you are confronted with many questions and also experiences what they had in their life. And you answered the second question what they had already. How did you come to start writing about the transgender issue? But won't you add something about this point? Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it's there's a lot of challenges in today's world. We're told by the media to be very sensitive to the feelings of certain groups of people, and certain groups of people are chosen that we have to be sensitive about. But if you look at the data on the damage that transgender theory and policies create, we're not asked to look at the harm. and that other people experience. We're not asked to understand their feelings, and their feelings seem to come second. But I have a worldview. I developed a worldview where I was teaching about development, and because I taught a lot of positive psychology. And in positive psychology, we talk about three main areas of where human beings can get most fulfillment out of life, most joy, a feeling of being blessed. And one might call that the three blessings worldview, whereby there are three main areas of life. And the first is that if you visit a website like Authentic Happiness, which deals with positive psychology, you can see that there's three main areas, and one of them is called flow, which means becoming good at something, developing yourself, growing yourself, becoming good at your talents, your sports, becoming good with other people, just a sense of I can manage, I can do better, and that sense of becoming growing, it brings a lot of joy to people. And the second area which we talk about is like social relationships, families. And most people in life tend to get most of their joys from within their family relationships with their children, husband or wife, and feeling like you did a good job there, and loved and laughed and did a reasonable job as a parent is probably the most meaningful thing that a large number of us can ever experience. And the last thing is our work life, of course, and feeling like we're doing something meaningful on the earth, and maybe taking care of the planet a bit, and somehow growing in that role and taking on more responsibility. We find that people are far happier when they're growing and doing something meaningful. And so there's like three areas of life. And so I kind of analyze everything through that. And so if a culture is getting those three things right, if it's helping people develop in the area of flow and develop in families and doing better in their professional life, then the culture becomes happier, and people become happier in general. But in the data, it shows that in general, large groups of young people are suffering worse experiences than their parents did. And therefore, there's something within our cultures which is causing young people to either suffer within their ability to grow up and flow and develop, or more and more people are struggling to build long-term relationships. And it's hard for people to get on the property ladder, to save, and all kinds of things are happening amongst the poor, the young. And it's very evident in the data. And so I look at what is being corrupted within any area of the three blessings, three areas of life, to cause that negative effect. And so when the transgender issue comes along, it's very evident that the area of personal development for many young people was starting to be corrupted by this ideology or this theory, and it would bring about worse outcomes. And so it became, I became concerned about the development of some groups of children who would suffer worse outcomes with this theory. And so that's how I kind of got into this. A long story, but that's how I get there.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Stephen, because you explained that this is like these three areas of blessing, which is really people should experience. But as I understand that it's not so easy anymore for young people to get to this point where they can really develop, and because there's so many obstacles, and one of them is this transgender issue, what you really researched very thoroughly, and in your book you bring many examples and studies, and it's really amazing what kind of collection of wisdom you accumulated. And for me it was striking that you say in a statement like that many people say, oh, he was born in a body of the wrong sex, and the woman is born in the body of a man, and the man is born in woman's body. And you research then in the book, and you really say that this you question this point that this doesn't have to be absolutely that even just somebody says, I feel I'm a man, because, or even have a body of a woman, and vice versa. So what is your answer? What showed your research for this point?
Yeah, well, you know, you kind of, it's developed, you know, over the last few years. I mean, we have to look back at the earliest moments of the transgender issue, and the first groups of people that became transgender. And the research showed there were two main kinds of males. In the male, it was mainly males who wanted to switch from looking like a male to looking like a female. And there were two great types. There were homosexual men who were very feminine in nature, and they felt that they'd rather be a woman because they were so feminine in their expression, and in their relationship with their partner, they often took the more feminine role, and so they wanted to transition. And there was a second group of people that was found to be males who had grown up, who'd become professionals and built a family, and then somewhere in the middle of their lives, they developed a very strong. There was a nagging voice in their brain, which kept on saying, you know, you will look beautiful as a woman. And it just kept on nagging and nagging and nagging at them, and they started to cross-dress and started to, you know, put women's clothing on and things like that. And they started to enjoy the fact that they looked like a woman. But in every other way, they were males. They thought like males. They still were attracted to women, but they just liked themselves as women. And it was called autogynephilia. And it was Dr. Blanchard who studied this intensely. It was defined as a male's propensity to be sexually aroused by the thought or image of a person being a female. So there were two main groups. But of course, over the last few years, all this has changed, this dynamic. So it's seen as a psychological disorder, treated as such. Many people were treated with it, overcame their problems, overcame their urges to look like a member of the opposite sex. Some didn't, of course, but it was seen as a psychological issue very clearly. And the early research on the children of gender dysphoria, because those were the adults, was mainly carried out by a professional called Dr. Zucker up in Canada, and he had a relationship with over 500 children who experienced what I would call gender confusion. They were confused about which gender they were, and he found that of those 500, when he studied their lives and researched them, that most of them had pre-existing psychological problems. They had other psychological problems. They had anxiety, social anxiety. They didn't feel comfortable around people of their own sex, or they suffered from depression, or a lot of them suffered from autism. They had been sexually abused, and they thought, if I transition to a member of the opposite sex, maybe I won't be raped again. Maybe if I'm a woman, maybe if I become a man, I won't be raped. Or they had suffered mental trauma. So he found these things, or he found mental issues in the parents, or even parents who wanted a boy, but they got a girl, or girl that wanted a boy, and they really kind of pushed that on the child. They hoped that their child would, they push subconsciously or subconsciously push that on their child. And so he found that these children had various psychological issues, and with time and patience, he could help them. And in my own research, because today there's an awful lot of testimonies by young people, because over the last 5 years, they've partially transitioned or completely transitioned, and then they realize that they made a mistake, and then they make videos on YouTube, or they write articles, and you can, there's quite hundreds of them, and you can say, they tell you why they wanted to transition, why they had gender confusion, and it's exactly the same as Dr. Zucker found. So we have a clinic, one main clinic in London, which deals with gender confused children, And the research on the children that apply there, about 30% have autism. In other words, they don't feel comfortable around people of their own. They find it hard to read social clues, especially people of their own sex. And they get on people better of their other sex, and they start to feel, I feel more comfortable. They just have autism. Or they've been sexually abused, about 30% probably. Then there's all kinds of other things like same-sex attraction. The young people experience same-sex attraction start to think, well, maybe because I'm attracted to the person of the same sex, maybe I'm a transgender person. Maybe I have a sex change. We also see Dr. Littman, another researcher. She found in the recent years social contagion. So, for example, groups of girls, especially one girl would say, well, that would be cool. We can look cool if we transition. If we say we're transgender, we'll be the cool girls. It's become a cool symbol in some schools. And so 3 or 4 together would all claim they're transgender, etc. There's, so I found, very similar things. In other words, there's no one cause. And a lot of it's to do with psychological issues in children. So that's what we found. And Dr. Zucker, who worked with these 500 children, he found that over time he could help like 98% of boys, feel comfortable in a body of their own sex. In other words, they just needed some help, guidance, time, change of practices by parents or something, and they started to feel comfortable. And about 85% of girls he could help. Yeah. And he wrote this up. He wrote this all up, all his protocols, everything. In 2012, he wrote them up. It's called a developmental biopsychological model for the treatment of children with gender identity disorder. So, so here we are. We have a psychological disorder. We can see it very clearly in the data. And, it's not just his work. There's other work. There's other pieces of research, like I got one here. 77 gender-confused children. They started them, testing them on average. They were 8 years old. And 10 years later, almost none of the children had gender, identity issues. They were happy with the body of their own sex. Yeah. They moved on. They grew up. They overcame their problems, whatever. So, it was very clear in the early data that this was a psychological issue. And to now transfer it into a political rights issue, that these are people who are born in the right, is just a lie. It's just a complete lie, fabricated lie. And it's very tragic because lots of young children today are being transitioned. Yeah? You probably know, I don't know what's happening in Austria, but in many,
of course, it's the same.
Many countries are just quick interview. Nobody talks about the psychological problems they're experiencing, why they're doing this, and they start to be put on cross-sex hormones and operations. And many are starting to regret it, but it's too late. Yeah.
Well, this is a big thing, like you said, young grown-up persons to be transgender or going like a way of how they feel. But for children is in these young people, they are mostly the parents responsible. So you think that it's very important to also inform the parents, because I can imagine that many parents are quite helpless and getting also social pressure, and they don't want to think that their children are psychologically ill, because many parents are very, thinking, okay, if they want like this, let them go their way, because I love my child. I don't want to push it in something inside. But still, like you are warning, as I understand from the consequences, that there is this like a social pressure. There's also a lot of money involved in this kind of situations. It's not just that everybody is thinking of the well-being of these young people and thinking, okay, let them do as they are. And you suggested even that later, when they're grown up, if you leave them alone, more or less, or get some social, like psychological treatment, they would like develop like other young people, as a man, as a young lady. So what do you think, what are the like social or the money interests in this kind of development, that people are pushed and even cornered in that situation, that they are not shut down. They don't want to speak up about this kind of thing openly.
Yeah, there's, I mean, all kinds of issues going. You know, every country is at a different stage of this issue, and they're doing different legislation in different countries. You know, some countries, the parents aren't allowed to stop the child. They're not even allowed to, some countries, you're not allowed to offer counseling to the children. You know, all kinds of things are going on, which make it extremely hard to help the child understand. You know, the child has misdiagnosed their psychological issue. They've probably gone online. They've probably done a stupid test, which says you're definitely transgender. They've been given advice, and they believe they are, and that, you know, they're on a path, and yet, no, you know, some countries you can't do anything to stop that now. In some countries like Canada, your child will be taken away from you if you try to stop them. And so parents are caught, you know, they let their child transition, but then they have to look after this damaged, it's seriously damaged child often, or adult, and have to live with that for the rest of their life. And it's frightening, it's deeply frightening. And many people don't, many teachers especially, and social workers, do not understand the negative consequences of transitioning. Everything looks like, oh, they live happily ever after as a male or female. But it's just not like that. It's really tragic. Yeah, I would say the transgenders lead the most tragic lives out of all people within the West, you would say, on average. Some, of course, some have very joy, you know, when they're young, they can look like women, they can have a joyful time, whatever. But over time, it's exhausting looking like them and keeping your body. So, you know, the first thing is that when you talk about transgendered individual who's gone through operation and taking, you know, what kind of life they have, you know, they have a much higher rate of health problems because they're taking drugs which are harmful for their body. They often have they find it difficult to find a job and keep a job. You know, therefore they are much higher rates of poverty. They have higher rates of homelessness. Some of them get into prostitution just to make money. They have to deal with their psychological problems, which haven't gone away often. That many quite a large number end up in prison. And so it's quite a difficult, very difficult life. Then, of course, they have extra violence from their partners who abuse them because that's the world of transgenderism. It becomes that. And, they find it hard to find a long-term partner. There's a lot of loneliness. So all the things that you would say, you know, constitute a, you know, blessed life, you might say, building a family, a career, they're taken away from many of them, and they suffer loneliness. And as a result, you know, what's the point? Here am I, unhealthy, can't find a job, can't build all those things that give like meaning to life. And so they have a 20 times higher rate of suicide than the norm. And it's a tragic life for many of them. And, you know, so it's, you know, today the young children, as I said, they don't often even have a proper interview or counseling sessions, you know, to help them understand. They don't know, they're not told about the damages. They don't understand the damages. You know, if you're taking cross-sex hormones, you know, a lot of young people are put on cross-sex hormone, or if they're young enough, puberty blockers to stop puberty. But these are, these, you know, women, for example, who take testosterone for even, you know, less than over 6 months or so, you know, they have permanent lower voice, permanent. Yeah, they start to go bald. They start to grow facial hair. They have many of them have acne problems, etc., etc. And this is permanent, you might say, yeah? So this is a young child, he's 14, 15, starts to take these things, and that's it. You're going to be bald, and you realize 3 years later, you're really a woman, and it's like, what have I done, you know? And the men, they have permanent sterility, and the women have permanent infertility, you know. and they've lost their ability to create a child, create a family. It's just because of some stupid person on the internet who told them they're transgendered. And we are meant to protect them. We are, as a society, counselors, parents, social, are meant to protect them from these crazy people, but we can't do it. Yeah. And then, of course, there's all the physical problems. They have higher rates of cardiac arrest or blood pressure, blood clots. The bones start to go fragile because they're later in life, and cancers increase. And no child understands what that means. You know, they don't understand these things, that you're going to lose professional chance to get jobs, and you're going to have serious health problems. And it looks so nice on the, they present it so nicely in the media, but it's a lonely life for many of them. And it's very painful that we refuse to look at the damage. Yeah. So many professionals say this is actually legalized. This is state-sponsored child abuse. The state is abusing children.
It's very tragic, yeah.
Yeah, and the Nuremberg Code, which we all, which was set up after the war because medical experiments were carried out on prisoners, yeah, against their will, and everybody signed up to it and said, so when you go to the doctors today and you're going to have an operation or something, you have to sign a paper. You have to sign a paper and say, I fully understand the consequences of this operation. I might die. I fully understand, I'm going to lose this or that. But the children today, they're not told what's going to happen often, or they don't comprehend it. They can't understand this, yeah? And so when at school, when they teach transgenderism at school, they don't talk about the negative side effects and things like that. And so these children are medical experience. Nobody knows actually what the damage will be, because we've never done this to children before on such a large level. And so you can't inform the children because we don't know. But we're doing this to our children today. And in Australia, thousands of children. In England, thousands of children. America, tens of thousands of children. We're setting this future up for them. And it's going to cause a lot of problems in the future. And doctors, we have, as I said, the Tavistock Institute here in England, and doctors and nurses are resigning. So many have resigned because they believe that these children are being rushed into this, and they cannot stomach it. But it carries on. Yeah. So,
it's a good reason to be worried.
Yeah, you're worried. Of course, the problem, one of the key problems is the fact that the children say, well, I'll commit suicide. They go online, they get the test, and they're told by these experts online that all you do is say, I'm going to commit suicide if you don't transition. Yeah? And so everybody's terrified.
Okay.
Nobody wants to feel, oh, I didn't transition that child and therefore they committed suicide. Yeah? But if you look at the early research, if you look at Dr. Zucker's work with 500 children and the early research, suicide was like just wasn't really at all mentioned. It just wasn't an issue. Yeah. Of course, children who have been sexually abused, physically abused, autism, have been bullied for all kinds of reasons or whatever, are automatically more likely to have suicidal thoughts. It's just a fact of life. And so when you ask a transgender child, of course, on average, they're going to have higher rates of suicidal thoughts, but it could be for any reason, and they could commit suicide for any one of those reasons.
Yeah.
But people, because the media takes that one child that says I'm transgendered, who commits suicide, and says, why didn't we help them and transition? Then and everybody's, the professional are terrified of being seen to be that person who stopped them.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But the media refuses to report all the children who did transition and do commit suicide. They don't make a big deal. Why did you let that child transition? They don't say anything. So the media makes it a one-way street, makes it hard for professionals to do their job, to speak truthfully. And it's very, very problem, because if you listen to the people online, if you just go on YouTube and try detransition, and and listen to their testimonies about the difficulties of their life, it's very painful. And many of them say, I wish somebody had listened to me and really understood my problem before I did this and became sterile. You know?
Yeah, that's very, very, how to say, really tragic that so many things happen. And like you say, the personal consequences of young, like grown up people is already tragic enough because of the social consequences, because no families, no children come.
Yeah,
Then of course, then the other question comes, even there are two men, two women live together, they still want to have children.
yeah,
And but of course, the social consequences, I think it will, the community will have to pay for that, basically,
yeah. The
in the
community has to
future.
pay.
And
Yeah,
for young children and young people, let's say under 20 or under 18, it is the parents' responsibility. But as you said, parents get pressure from the society, media. I think the media cannot be surprised if nobody believes them anymore, because they are not acting responsible, as I can take it from your words. Because if they would take it responsible, then they would research and see both sides of the coin, that there are many issues behind, and you cannot so simply say, oh, if he wants that, give him that. No? And the other point, what you mentioned in your book, is like, and what the title is also, as a nation, that we make laws to make it very difficult to detransition or to turn away from this harmful transgender, because almost nobody believes you that you want to detransition. And
yes.
how do you see that? For
How
example,
do I
that,
see? How do I
uh,
see the legislation? Or
yes, how do they push these laws that is more difficult
yeah, well,
to transition?
there's you know, one has to kind of catch, like, why is it happening? Because you know, the doctors, as I said, the doctors who used to work with these children, you know, the ones at the earlier years, they say, well, what are you doing? You can talk to them, you can listen to them online. They give videos and they talk about the history, and they talk about why it shouldn't be done. But still the governments push ahead, and you know, one has to question why it's happening, what happened. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, and of course, you know, well, the first thing is that the first problem is that some, you know, because the earliest hospital that kind of mainly helped people transition was called John Hopkins in America.
Okay.
There was kind of, and they, you know, they followed these people and they tried to see what happened to them, and they found some led more contented lives, but an awful lot had worse lives, and an awful lot had, you know, just still had the psychological problems. And so they stopped the operation. They said, you know, these operations, if we did another operation which created worse outcomes for 50% of the patients than before the operation, we wouldn't
Yeah,
we wouldn't
that's,
issue, you know, we would try and find another way to solve the
yeah.
problem. So they stopped the operations. But still, some doctors, very corrupt doctors, wanted to push ahead with this because the money involved, especially, and they formed an association called WPATH, and they've created very what I would call corrupt research, which had no, you know, they had no. In all good research, you have to have another group which going another path. You follow the path of one people, and they didn't have, you know, any other group. They only followed children who they transitioned, and they only peer reviewed. Normally, when you do the research, you have to send the review, you know, the research out to others, but they only reviewed it amongst themselves, and they forgot all the protocols. And so this research became, you know, self-answering, that it's good to transition children.
Yeah.
And they became the main voices within the medical, about transitioning within the medical associate, some medical associations. So the medical stations said, well, what would you do to these children? And then they, in the protocols of the psychological protocols, they start putting this suggested, protocols of this corrupt organization. And then, so that's troubling. And then you've got transgender individuals who are very wealthy, extremely wealthy people who maybe run corporate, there's a couple and who run a very wealthy, they're very rich, and they run a large corporation which deals with drugs and these kind of things. And they think, well, we want to support the transgender cause because we're transgendered, and we're going to we'll pay a university, and they'll set up a department of transgender studies, and you get we will train doctors, and we'll train these, and these doctors then write research papers, and then you get a whole, and then of course these corporations these start coming in because they start using their drugs and equipment and things like that. So and this is lifelong drugs, yeah. So it's very, very wealthy, Okay. And so you get corporations starting to influence the universities with money, and they and then you've got the university itself, which is how one say, there are political activists within the university system itself which are quite happy to support this because they know it weakens the West, which is something they've trying to do for years, and they also know it this theory brings more power to government. They understand that it limits free speech, it gives more power to the government, and they want the government to have more powers, and they want decay, and they push it as well. So, and then you get other groups like, for example, maybe abortion providers who start saying, well, we can start to also provide services for transgenders. We can provide medicines on a daily basis. So they start offering political contributions so that the politicians will pass laws to allow children to walk into them and get drugs without parental consent. And then they get money, and it just takes on a life of its own. Then you got the media who are, who just refuse to do any proper research on it, and they're guided by like a media watchdog. What should be said on transgender issue and what shouldn't be said, and they're not allowed to say anything else. So this watchdog, once it gets infected, that media can only kind of say what the transgender and what follow the transgender story of born in the wrong body, and it just takes on a life of its own, and nobody's allowed to fight back. No, anybody who says anything different is called transphobic, and not these are people who need mental health and need help, and we need to stop transitioning young children, and it just becomes impossible to stop it almost. And politicians themselves become frightened. Research was done on the politicians in England, for example.
Okay.
And they were asked, how free do you feel to talk about this subject with science in mind? How free and open do you feel? And over 50% said they were terrified of talking about it, to be seen as transphobic by the media, to be picked on, and to lose, to be hounded out of their, because the media would treat, go after them. So they can't even when even the legislators can't pass healthy legislation because they're frightened of their careers. Then you're really stuck. As people, you're as a nation, you're stuck in this groove, and the media makes sure that you're stuck. And
it's a big issue, because many politicians, they are not specialists in this in many cases, like education or health. But if they don't listen to the right experts or even take of course they have to take the decision basically, but at least to get both sides, not to really see and then they would evaluate what is good for what is good for society and for the most of people. No?